In 1986, a 72-year-old church organist named Margaret Phillips vanished without a trace after her usual evening practice at St. Andrew's Methodist Church in Cedar Falls, Iowa. For 30 years, Margaret had been the faithful music director, her fingers dancing across the organ keys every Sunday morning and Wednesday evening, her presence as reliable as the church bells that called the congregation to worship. But on a cold December evening, she simply disappeared, leaving behind only an empty organ bench and a congregation desperate for answers. 17 years later, when church movers entered the cramped attic space above the sanctuary to relocate old furniture, they would make a discovery so shocking that it would finally solve the mystery of Margaret Phillips and reveal a truth that would forever change how the congregation understood dedication, sacrifice, and the hidden dangers that lurk in the places we consider most sacred. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The story begins on December 18th, 1986. A Thursday evening that started like countless others in Margaret's carefully ordered life. St. Andrew's Methodist Church stood like a red brick sentinel at the corner of Main and Elm, its Gothic windows glowing warmly against the early winter darkness. The building had been constructed in 1923, during an era when craftsmanship mattered more than efficiency, resulting in a structure filled with hidden spaces, narrow staircases, and storage areas that seemed to multiply the deeper one explored. Margaret had arrived at 6:30, just as she had every Thursday for 3 decades, her worn leather music bag clutched against her thin frame as she made her way through the side entrance that led directly to the sanctuary. Margaret Phillips was the kind of woman small towns are built upon, someone whose quiet competence and unwavering commitment formed the invisible backbone of community life. Born Margaret Louise Thompson in 1914, she had grown up in a modest farmhouse just outside Cedar Falls, the daughter of a corn farmer and a schoolteacher who had instilled in her both a strong work ethic and a deep appreciation for education and culture. Her musical talents had emerged early, nurtured by her mother's piano lessons and encouraged by teachers who recognized her exceptional ability to not just play music, but to truly understand it. She had married her high school sweetheart, Robert Phillips, in 1934, a union that had produced 3 children and 42 years of what friends described as genuine partnership. Robert had worked as a supervisor at the local John Deere plant, while Margaret had taught piano lessons from their modest home on Sycamore Street, building a reputation throughout Cedar Falls as someone who could coax musical ability from even the most reluctant students. Her teaching philosophy emphasized not just technical proficiency, but musical understanding and emotional expression, qualities that would later make her such an exceptional church organist. When Robert died suddenly of a heart attack in 1956, leaving Margaret a widow at 42 with the youngest child still in elementary school, she could have easily become one of those women who fade into the background of small-town life. Instead, she threw herself into her music with renewed purpose, accepting the position of church organist at St. Andrew's and transforming what had been a simple musical accompaniment into something approaching artistry. The decision to take the church position had been both practical and spiritual, providing her with a modest income while allowing her to channel her grief into service to others. By 1986, Margaret had become more than just the church organist. She had become the guardian of St. Andrew's musical soul. She arrived early every Sunday to practice the morning selections, stayed late after services to help with special musical arrangements, and spent countless hours during the week preparing for holiday services and special events. Her meticulous nature meant that every anthem was perfectly arranged, every hymn flawlessly accompanied, and every musical transition smoothly executed. The congregation had grown accustomed to her excellence, perhaps taking for granted the hours of preparation that went into each Sunday's seeming effortless performance. Pastor William Hendricks, who had worked closely with Margaret for nearly a decade, would later describe her as the most dedicated volunteer he had ever encountered. He had arrived at St. Andrews in 1978, a young minister fresh from seminary who had initially been intimidated by Margaret's deep knowledge of church, music and her exacting standards. Over the years, however, he had come to appreciate not just her musical abilities, but her profound understanding of how music could enhance worship and create spiritual experiences that transcended mere words. Margaret possessed an almost supernatural ability to sense what each service needed musically, whether it was the gentle comfort of traditional hymns during times of loss or the triumphant celebration of contemporary arrangements during joyful occasions. Her small frame, barely 5 feet tall and weighing perhaps 90 pounds, belied a powerful musical presence, and when she played, the entire sanctuary seemed to pulse with spiritual energy. She had a particular gift for selecting music that complemented Pastor Hendricks' sermons, often choosing pieces that reinforced his message in ways that seemed almost telepathic. But Margaret's dedication went far beyond Sunday morning performances. She had taken it upon herself to organize and maintain the church's extensive collection of sheet music, a task that had grown increasingly complex as the collection expanded over the decades. The church had acquired music from various sources. Over the years, donations from deceased members' families, purchases for special events, arrangements created for specific services, and Margaret had appointed herself as the unofficial archivist of this musical library. She spent hours cataloguing pieces, organizing them by season and occasion, and ensuring that nothing was lost or forgotten. Her system was elaborate and personal, involving color-coded folders, detailed index cards, and a filing method that made sense to her but would have been incomprehensible to anyone else. She maintained separate collections for different types of services: regular Sunday worship, special holiday celebrations, weddings, funerals, and community events. Each piece was carefully preserved in protective sleeves, with notes about when it had been performed, how well it had been received, and any modifications she had made to accommodate the church's organ or the choir's capabilities. The church building itself was a testament to early 20th century craftsmanship, with high ceilings, intricate woodwork, and a network of storage spaces that seemed to multiply the deeper one explored. The main sanctuary could seat nearly 300 people, with dark wooden pews arranged in traditional rows facing the pulpit and altar area. The choir loft was positioned behind the pulpit, elevated to provide both visual prominence and acoustic advantage, with the massive pipe organ dominating the space with its impressive array of brass pipes and wooden casework. The organ was Margaret's pride and joy, a 1925 Kilgan instrument that had been installed shortly after the church's construction. It featured 2 manual keyboards, a full pedal board, and 32 ranks of pipes that could produce everything from the softest flute tones to thunderous bass notes that seemed to shake the building's foundation. Margaret had studied the instrument's capabilities with the dedication of a scholar, learning to coax from its subtle shadings and dramatic effects that had transformed Sunday morning worship into something approaching concert performance. Above the sanctuary, accessible only by a narrow staircase hidden behind a door that most congregants had never noticed, lay an attic space that had been used for storage since the building's construction in 1923. The staircase itself was steep and narrow, with worn, wooden steps and a simple rope handrail that had been installed as an afterthought. The door at the top opened into a space that followed the roofline, with slanted ceilings that made it impossible to stand upright in many areas, and supporting beams that created irregular passages between different storage zones. This attic space had become Margaret's special domain over the years. Unlike the main storage areas that were easily accessible and frequently used by various church committees, the attic remained largely untouched, except for Margaret's periodic expeditions to organize and rearrange the growing collection of musical materials stored there. The space was not just cramped, but also poorly lit, with only a few bare bulbs hanging from the rafters and small windows at either end that provided minimal natural light. The flooring was rough wooden planking, with gaps between boards that had widened over the decades, and the entire space had the musty smell of old wood, paper, and decades of accumulated dust. Despite these challenging conditions, Margaret had created an organized storage system in the attic that reflected her methodical approach to everything else in her musical life. She had installed wooden shelving along the walls, purchased with her own money and assembled with help from her son David during one of his visits from Des Moines. Boxes were carefully labeled and arranged by category, with seasonal music separated from regular worship materials and special event pieces organized according to her own logical system. The attic also contained other church historical materials, boxes of old photographs, records from previous decades, and various items that had been deemed too important to discard but not necessary for regular access. Margaret had become the unofficial custodian of these materials as well, occasionally venturing into the space to retrieve something for a historical display or to research the church's musical heritage for special anniversary celebrations. On that December evening in 1986, Margaret had arrived at the church with her usual purposeful energy, but those who saw her enter would later remember that she had seemed particularly focused and perhaps slightly anxious about something. Several congregation members saw her enter through the side door, her familiar silhouette briefly visible against the warm interior lights before the door closed behind her. Mrs. Eleanor Morrison, who lived across the street from the church, had been looking out her kitchen window while preparing dinner and noticed Margaret's arrival, later recalling that the organist had been carrying not just her usual music bag, but also what appeared to be a larger case or portfolio. The church secretary, Mrs. Dorothy Hanson, had left at 5:30 after finishing the weekly bulletin preparation, but not before having a brief conversation with Margaret about the upcoming Christmas Eve service. Hanson would later remember that Margaret had seemed excited about something special she was planning for the Christmas program, mentioning that she had been working on arrangements that would make this year's service particularly memorable. Pastor Hendricks had departed shortly after Hanson for a denominational meeting in Waterloo, leaving Margaret alone in the building, which was not unusual for her Thursday evening practice sessions. Margaret often preferred to practice alone, finding that the solitude allowed her to focus completely on the music without the distractions of conversation or interruption. She had explained to Pastor Hendricks that she could better hear the subtle nuances of the organ's voice when the building was empty, and she often spent these evening sessions not just practicing the upcoming Sunday's music, but experimenting with new arrangements and exploring the instrument's capabilities. The evening practice session was meant to be preparation for the following Sunday's service, but Margaret had also been working on something more ambitious. Christmas was approaching, and she had planned an elaborate musical program for Christmas Eve that would require careful coordination of multiple musical pieces, some traditional and some arranged specially for St. Andrew's unique circumstances. She had been gathering and organizing special arrangements for weeks, pulling from various sources in the church's collection and even arranging some pieces herself to create the perfect musical journey for the congregation's most important service of the year. What happened next would remain a mystery for 17 long years, but the evening's pattern was typical of Margaret's routine. She would have begun by reviewing the music for Sunday's service, playing through each piece to ensure she was completely prepared and making mental notes about any passages that required special attention or practice. She was known for her meticulous preparation, never allowing herself to be caught off guard by a difficult passage or an unfamiliar piece during actual worship services. Then she would have turned her attention to the Christmas program, possibly making notes about which pieces worked well together and which arrangements needed modification to fit the church's specific needs. Margaret had been developing what she called a musical narrative for the Christmas Eve service, a carefully planned sequence of pieces that would tell the story of Christ's birth through music, beginning with ancient hymns of anticipation and building to triumphant celebrations of the Nativity. Given her methodical nature and her excitement about the Christmas service, she would have likely decided to venture into the attic storage area to retrieve additional sheet music or to organize the pieces she had been collecting for the special program. This would not have been unusual. Margaret had made dozens of trips to the attic over the years, and she was familiar with both the challenging access route and the storage system she had created in the cramped space above the sanctuary. The narrow staircase leading to the attic required careful navigation even under the best circumstances. The steps were steep and worn smooth by decades of use, and the rope handrail provided minimal support for someone carrying materials. Margaret, despite her small stature and advancing age, had navigated these stairs countless times, but the combination of winter weather, evening darkness, and the physical demands of carrying musical materials up and down the steep staircase created inherent risks that no one had fully considered. When Margaret failed to appear for Sunday morning service on December 21st, the congregation initially assumed she must be ill. It was unprecedented for her to miss a service without notification, but even the most reliable people occasionally faced unexpected circumstances. Pastor Hendricks, who had returned from his denominational meeting late Friday evening, had tried calling Margaret's home Saturday evening to confirm the Sunday morning music selections, but had received no answer. This was unusual, but not alarming enough to prompt immediate concern. Sunday morning arrived with the kind of bitter cold that made even short walks from parking lots to church entrances an ordeal. The congregation gathered as usual, bundled in, winter coats and scarves, stamping their feet in the vestibule to restore circulation, and looking forward to the warmth of the sanctuary and the comfort of familiar worship routines. But when Pastor Hendricks took his place behind the pulpit for the opening of the service, the organ bench remained conspicuously empty. After waiting several minutes beyond the usual starting time, Pastor Hendricks asked one of the younger church members, Susan Walsh, who had some piano training, to fill in at the organ. Walsh later described the experience as terrifying, attempting to accompany hymns on an instrument she barely understood while 300 pairs of eyes watched her. Every move, the substitute performance, lacked Margaret's practiced polish and subtle understanding of the congregation's needs, and everyone in attendance was acutely aware that something fundamental was missing from their worship experience. By Sunday afternoon, when Margaret still had not contacted anyone at the church or responded to phone calls to her home, concern began to grow into genuine worry. Dorothy Hanson, the church secretary, drove to Margaret's house on Sycamore Street around 2 o'clock, hoping to find a simple explanation for the morning's absence. What she discovered instead was deeply troubling. Margaret's modest two-story home, which she had shared with Robert for more than 40 years and had continued to maintain meticulously as a widow, showed clear signs of abandonment. Newspapers were piled on the front porch, including Fridays and Saturdays editions, and mail was overflowing from the mailbox mounted beside the front door. The house was locked, which was not unusual for Margaret, who had become more security-conscious in recent years, but peering through the windows revealed no signs of recent activity. Hanson used a spare key that Margaret had given her years earlier for emergencies and entered the house, calling Margaret's name and hoping to find her perhaps ill in bed or unable to reach the telephone. Instead, she found a house that felt frozen in time, as if its occupant had simply vanished in the middle of her normal routine. Thursday's mail remained unopened on the kitchen counter, next to a coffee cup that still contained the remnants of what appeared to be Thursday morning's coffee. Margaret's bed was made, but clearly had not been slept in, and her usual evening routine of preparing for the next day had obviously been interrupted. Most significantly, Margaret's car was not in the driveway or the single-car garage behind the house. This initially provided some hope that she might have traveled somewhere for an emergency, perhaps called away suddenly to help a family member or friend. However, when Hansen contacted the church to report her findings, she learned that Margaret's car had been observed in the church parking lot throughout the weekend, parked in its usual spot behind the building. Margaret's children were scattered across the Midwest with their own families, but Hansen and Pastor Hendricks began making phone calls to locate them and determine whether any had heard from their mother recently. The eldest, David Phillips, lived in Des Moines where he worked as an insurance agent, while daughter Sarah had moved to Minneapolis after her marriage, and the youngest, Robert Jr., was stationed with the Air Force in Colorado. None had heard from their mother in the past week, and all confirmed that she had not mentioned any travel plans during recent conversations. David Phillips immediately arranged to drive to Cedar Falls, making the 2-hour journey through increasingly harsh winter weather while battling growing fears about what might have happened to his mother. He arrived Sunday evening to find Hansen and Pastor Hendricks waiting at the church with a story that made no logical sense. His mother had apparently entered the church Thursday evening for her regular practice session and had simply vanished, leaving behind her car, her purse, and no explanation for her disappearance. The Cedar Falls Police Department was contacted Monday morning, and Detective Robert Manning began what would become one of the most puzzling missing person cases in the town's history. Manning was a 20-year veteran of the force, experienced in the kinds of crimes and mysteries that occasionally disrupted small-town tranquility. But Margaret Phillips's disappearance presented challenges unlike anything he had previously encountered. Margaret's car was located within hours, parked in its usual spot in the church parking lot behind the building. The car, a well-maintained 1982 Buick that Margaret had purchased after Robert's death, was locked and showed no signs of disturbance. Her purse was visible on the passenger seat, containing her wallet with $43 in cash, her driver's license and other identification, credit cards that showed no recent unusual activity, and all her usual personal items including reading glasses, tissues, and throat drops that she kept for choir rehearsals. The car's interior revealed nothing unusual, just the typical contents of an elderly woman's carefully maintained vehicle. The trunk contained emergency supplies, a spare coat, and a box of sheet music that Margaret apparently transported between her home and the church. There were no signs of struggle, no indication of mechanical problems that might have stranded her, and no obvious explanation for why Margaret would have left her car at the church and disappeared. Detective Manning's investigation began with the assumption that Margaret must have left the church with someone else, either voluntarily or under duress. He systematically interviewed every member of the congregation who might have had contact with Margaret that evening, but no one reported seeing her after she entered the church at 6:30. The few people who had been in the downtown area that evening remembered seeing lights in the church windows, which was normal for Margaret's practice sessions, but no one had observed any unusual activity or unfamiliar vehicles near the building. Church building itself was thoroughly searched over the following days, a process that revealed the complexity of the 1923 structure and the numerous spaces where someone could potentially be hidden or trapped. Pastor Hendricks provided keys and detailed knowledge of the building's layout, while volunteers from the congregation systematically examined every room, closet, and storage area. The main sanctuary showed clear signs of Margaret's presence. Her music bag was found on the organ bench, with Thursday evening sheet music neatly arranged, and the organ showed evidence of recent use, with several stops pulled and music still positioned on the console. However, there were no signs of disturbance, no indication of any struggle or unexpected interruption to her practice session. The music on the organ console included pieces for Sunday's service, as well as several Christmas arrangements, suggesting that Margaret had been working on her holiday preparations when whatever happened to her occurred. Her winter coat was found, hanging in the small closet adjacent to the choir loft, indicating that she had planned to stay in the building for an extended period and had not left voluntarily. The search expanded to include the church basement, which housed the fellowship hall, kitchen facilities, and additional storage rooms that were used for various church activities. The basement was a maze of interconnected rooms, some dating to the original construction and others added over the decades as the church's programs expanded. Every space was carefully examined, from the large fellowship hall that could accommodate church dinners and social events to small storage closets that hadn't been opened in years. The kitchen facilities were particularly thoroughly searched, as they contained numerous areas where someone could potentially be concealed, including large pantries, walk-in storage areas, and even the dumbwaiter that had been installed in the 1940s to transport food between the basement kitchen and the main floor social areas. The dumbwaiter had not been used in years and was found to be inoperative, but investigators examined it thoroughly as part of their comprehensive search. Additional storage areas throughout the building were systematically examined, including closets containing choir robes, Sunday school supplies, and seasonal decorations. The church's extensive collection of folding tables and chairs, stored in various locations throughout the building, was moved and examined, and even the small spaces behind the organ pipes were investigated. The building's multiple entrances were all secured, with no signs of forced entry or unusual activity, and all windows were found to be locked from the inside. Despite the thoroughness of the search, investigators found nothing that provided any clue to Margaret's disappearance. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air somewhere between her Thursday evening arrival and Friday morning. The mystery deepened when investigators learned from congregation members that Margaret was known for her predictable routines and her habit of informing people about any changes to her normal schedule. Her sudden disappearance was completely out of character and inconsistent with her responsible and considerate nature. As days turned into weeks, the investigation expanded beyond the immediate vicinity of the church. Detective Manning worked with neighboring law enforcement agencies to search parks, rural areas, and abandoned buildings within a 50-mile radius of Cedar Falls. The harsh Iowa winter complicated these efforts, as snow cover made ground searches difficult and potentially dangerous. But dozens of volunteers joined professional searchers in systematic examinations of areas where Margaret might have gone or where evidence of her fate might be found. The Des Moines River, which flowed through Cedar Falls several miles from the church, was searched as thoroughly as winter conditions allowed. Divers examined areas where the water remained unfrozen, while search teams with poles and probes investigated sections where ice cover made diving impossible. Several quarries and ponds in the area were also searched based on the possibility that Margaret might have been taken to a remote location or that she might have wandered away from the church in a confused state and met with an accident. The investigation also explored the possibility that Margaret had been the victim of robbery or violence, perhaps targeted because of her known routine of working alone in the church building during evening hours. Detective Manning interviewed every person who had any known connection to Margaret, from current and former piano students to tradesmen who had done work at her home or the church. Background checks were conducted on anyone who might have had access to the church building or knowledge of Margaret's schedule. The psychological impact of Margaret's disappearance rippled through the St. Andrew's congregation like stones thrown into still water, creating expanding circles of concern, fear, and bewilderment that touched every aspect of community life. For many members, Margaret had been a constant presence in their spiritual lives for so long that her absence felt like a fundamental alteration in the nature of reality itself. Her music had provided the soundtrack to their most important moments of worship, celebration, and mourning, from weddings and baptisms to funeral services and holiday celebrations. Pastor Hendricks found himself counseling congregation members who were struggling with questions that had no answers, people whose faith was being tested by the inexplicable disappearance of someone they had considered almost as reliable as the sunrise. How could someone simply disappear from a place that represented safety and sanctuary? What did Margaret's vanishing say about the reliability of the world they thought they understood? Some members began to fear that something sinister had occurred, that perhaps their beloved church organist had been the victim of violence or abduction by someone who had observed her vulnerable routine of working alone in the large building. The fear was not entirely irrational, as several congregation members pointed out that Margaret's Thursday evening practice sessions had been common knowledge throughout the community, and anyone with malicious intent could have easily determined when she would be alone in the building. The church's location on a busy downtown corner provided some security through visibility, but it also meant that Margaret's movements were predictable and observable by anyone who chose to watch. Others held on to hope that Margaret would eventually return with a reasonable explanation for her absence, perhaps having suffered some form of memory loss or confusion that had caused her to wander away and become lost. Stories circulated about elderly people who had disappeared for days or weeks, only to be found safe but disoriented in distant locations, unable to remember how they had gotten there or what had happened to them. These hopeful scenarios became less plausible as days passed without any sightings or evidence of Margaret's continued existence, but they provided some comfort to people desperate for any alternative to darker possibilities. The Christmas Eve service that Margaret had been preparing for with such care became a painful reminder of her absence and a test of the congregation's ability to continue functioning without her guiding musical presence. Pastor Hendricks and Susan Walsh, the young woman who had volunteered to serve as temporary organist, did their best to create a meaningful musical experience. But everyone in attendance was acutely aware that something essential was missing. From their most important worship service of the year, the carefully planned arrangements that Margaret had been organizing were never found, and investigators theorized that she might have been carrying them when she disappeared. The Christmas Eve service proceeded with standard selections from the church's regular music library. Pieces that were familiar and competently performed, but lacked the special touches and innovative arrangements that Margaret would have provided. The service was well attended and spiritually meaningful, but many congregation members left feeling that they had been deprived of what should have been a musical celebration worthy of the occasion. As 1987 began, the active search for Margaret Phillips gradually wound down, though her case remained officially open and Detective Manning continued to follow up on occasional tips and reported sightings. The leads that came in were typical of missing person cases, well-intentioned reports from people who thought they had seen Margaret in distant locations, usually accompanied by explanations that seemed plausible until investigated. A woman matching Margaret's description had been seen at a bus station in Chicago, at a shopping center in Omaha, at a restaurant in Minneapolis, But none of these sightings proved to be accurate when checked by local law enforcement agencies. Margaret's family, particularly her son David, refused to give up hope and continued to press for ongoing investigation. David Phillips took a leave of absence from his insurance job in Des Moines and moved temporarily to Cedar Falls, staying in his mother's house and coordinating with Detective Manning to ensure that every possible lead was thoroughly investigated. He hired a private investigator who specialized in missing person cases, a former FBI agent named Robert Caldwell, who had handled similar mysteries throughout the Midwest. Caldwell brought fresh perspective and additional resources to the case. But even professional expertise and sophisticated investigative techniques failed to uncover new leads or explanations. He conducted extensive interviews with everyone who had known Margaret, examined her financial records for any unusual activity, and investigated the possibility that she might have had secrets or problems that could explain her disappearance. What he found instead was a portrait of a woman whose life was almost remarkably simple and transparent, someone whose routines were so predictable and whose relationships were so stable that her sudden vanishing became even more mysterious. Church community slowly adapted to Margaret's absence, though the process was painful and incomplete. A series of substitute organists came and went over the following months, each bringing their own style and competence, but none possessing Margaret's deep understanding of the congregation's needs or her willingness to invest countless hours in preparation and organization. Some were technically superior musicians, trained at conservatories and capable of performances that were more sophisticated than Margaret's self-taught abilities, but they lacked her intuitive understanding of how music functioned within the specific context of St. Andrew's worship life. The congregation eventually hired Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, a retired music teacher from Cedar Falls High School, as their permanent organist. Patterson was competent and dependable, and she gradually won the respect and affection of the congregation, but everyone understood that she was Margaret's replacement rather than her successor. The musical program at St. Andrew's continued and even flourished under Patterson's direction, but it became something different from what it had been under Margaret's guidance, reflecting Patterson's more formal training and less personal approach. To church music, Margaret's house on Sycamore Street stood empty for several months, while her family held on to hope for her return and struggled with the legal and emotional complexities of dealing with a missing person's estate. The house gradually took on the abandoned appearance that marks properties whose owners have vanished, with newspapers accumulating, despite David's efforts to maintain the appearance of occupancy, and neighbors beginning to whisper about the tragedy that had befallen the quiet woman who had lived there for more than 50 years. Eventually, practical considerations forced difficult decisions about Margaret's belongings and financial affairs. David Phillips worked with attorneys to establish legal procedures for managing his missing mother's estate, a complex process complicated by the lack of certainty about her fate and the legal requirements for declaring someone dead in the absence of a body or definitive evidence. The process took nearly 2 years to complete and required court hearings that forced the family to confront the likelihood that Margaret would never return. The house was eventually sold to a young family who appreciated its solid construction and convenient location, but who knew nothing about Margaret Phillips except that she had been the previous owner who had mysteriously disappeared. Margaret's personal belongings were carefully sorted and preserved, with family members taking items of sentimental value and David maintaining boxes of his mother's papers and photographs in case they might someday provide clues to her disappearance, or in case she might somehow return. Her piano, the instrument on which she had taught countless Cedar Falls children and had practiced the pieces she would later perform at St. Andrew's, was donated to the church in her memory. It was placed in a small practice room adjacent to the sanctuary, where it served church musicians and visiting performers while providing a tangible connection to Margaret's musical legacy. A small brass plaque mounted on the piano simply read, "In memory of Margaret Phillips, 1914-1986, whose music brought joy to many hearts." Years passed, and Margaret Phillips became one of those local mysteries that communities carry in their collective memory, stories that are passed down from long-time residents to newcomers, and that become part of the shared history that defines a place. New congregation members at St. Andrew's learned about the dedicated organist who had vanished without explanation, while long-time members gradually stopped expecting her to walk through the church doors with an apology for her extended absence. Her disappearance became part of St. Andrew's institutional memory, referenced in church histories and remembered during anniversary celebrations, but also gradually becoming less vivid as the people who had known her personally aged and were replaced by newer members who knew her only as a story. Detective Manning, who had invested considerable time and emotional energy in the case, eventually retired from the Cedar Falls Police Department without ever solving the mystery of Margaret Phillips, carrying the case with him as one of those failures that define a career as much as the successes. Manning would later say that Margaret's disappearance haunted him throughout his remaining years on the force, representing the kind of case that challenges every assumption about how investigations should proceed and what outcomes are possible. The lack of evidence, the absence of witnesses, and the complete disappearance of a person from a secured building defied logical explanation and violated his understanding of how crimes were supposed to work. Even cases that remained officially unsolved usually provided some evidence, some leads, some indication of what might have happened. But Margaret Phillips had simply vanished as completely as if she had never existed. By the mid-1990s, Margaret's case had become what law enforcement professionals call a cold case, filed away with dozens of other unsolved mysteries, but no longer actively investigated. The original evidence was preserved in case new leads emerged, and the case file was periodically reviewed by different investigators who might bring fresh perspectives to the mystery. But these reviews revealed nothing new and generated no promising leads. Occasional reviews of the evidence revealed nothing that had been overlooked during the original investigation, and the passage of time made it increasingly unlikely that fresh witnesses or evidence would emerge. The people who had been alive and active in 1986 were aging, and some had died, taking with them any knowledge they might have possessed about Margaret's disappearance. The physical evidence from the church had been thoroughly examined and re-examined, but it consisted mainly of negative findings, the absence of signs of struggle, the lack of evidence pointing to any particular explanation. Margaret Phillips had become a ghost story, a cautionary tale about the unpredictability of life and the fragility of the routines we take for granted. Her name appeared in regional compilations of unsolved mysteries, and occasionally a true crime writer or amateur investigator would contact the Cedar Falls Police Department asking for information about her case. But these inquiries never led to new discoveries or solutions. The church building itself underwent various changes during the years following Margaret's disappearance, modifications necessitated by changing needs, aging infrastructure, and the natural evolution of a religious institution. Maintenance projects, remodeling efforts, and the natural wear and tear of time required ongoing attention to keep the 1923 structure functional and attractive for contemporary worship needs. In the early 1990s, the church installed a new heating system that required extensive work in the basement and modifications to ductwork throughout the building. The project provided another opportunity to search areas that might have been overlooked during the original investigation. But the renovation revealed nothing connected to Margaret's disappearance. The old heating system was removed, walls were opened to install new ductwork, and even some floors were temporarily removed to access utilities, but no trace of Margaret or evidence of her fate was discovered. The building's many storage spaces continued to accumulate the detritus of church life: boxes of old records, outdated equipment, seasonal decorations, and forgotten donations that seemed to multiply in the hidden corners and rarely accessed areas. Church committees periodically organized cleaning efforts that involved sorting through these accumulated materials, discarding items that were no longer needed, and reorganizing what remained, but these efforts rarely extended to the most remote storage areas. The church's musical program continued to evolve under different leadership, with new choir directors and organists bringing their own styles and preferences to worship services. The pipe organ that had been Margaret's pride and joy was maintained and occasionally upgraded, but it gradually began to show its age, requiring more frequent repairs and adjustments to keep it functioning properly. By the late 1990s, discussions began about the possibility of replacing or extensively renovating the aging instrument. In 2003, 17 years after Margaret Phillips had vanished, St. Andrew's Methodist Church faced a significant renovation project that would require extensive reorganization of the building's contents and infrastructure. The congregation had grown considerably since the 1980s, reflecting both the expansion of Cedar Falls and the church's success in attracting new members, and changing needs demanded modifications to the fellowship areas, kitchen facilities, and office spaces. The renovation project was ambitious and expensive, involving not just cosmetic improvements, but structural modifications that would make the building more accessible to elderly and disabled congregants and more efficient for contemporary church programming. Part of this renovation involved clearing out storage areas that had not been thoroughly organized in decades, including spaces that had been largely untouched since Margaret's disappearance. The task of clearing the various storage areas fell to a professional moving company that specialized in church and institutional relocations. Peterson Moving Services, based in Waterloo, had worked on similar projects throughout Iowa and understood the unique challenges of organizing decades of accumulated materials in historical buildings. The company's reputation for careful handling of valuable and historically significant items made them the obvious choice for a project that might uncover materials of historical importance to the congregation. The crew, led by Supervisor James Mitchell, arrived at St. Andrews on a crisp October morning in 2003, prepared to spend several weeks cataloging, sorting, and relocating the contents of various storage areas throughout the building. Mitchell was an experienced professional who had worked on church renovations for more than 15 years, and he understood both the practical challenges of moving accumulated materials and the emotional significance that seemingly ordinary items could hold for congregation members. The initial survey of the project revealed the extent of the challenge facing the moving crew. Decades of church life had resulted in an accumulation of materials that filled numerous storage areas throughout the building, from easily accessible closets near the main offices to remote spaces that required special equipment to access safely. The church leadership had provided detailed lists of items that were to be preserved, materials that could be discarded, and areas where special care was required due to the historical or monetary value of the contents. Mitchell and his team began their work in the more accessible storage rooms, methodically examining boxes and furniture that had been accumulating for years. Much of what they found was typical of church storage areas: outdated office equipment that had been replaced but not discarded, boxes of old newsletters and records that documented decades of church activities, seasonal decorations that had been superseded by newer purchases, and furniture that had been replaced but saved for possible future use. The work was routine but required patience and attention to detail, as many items needed to be evaluated individually to determine their value and appropriate disposition. Some boxes contained valuable historical materials, photographs and documents that chronicled the church's development over 8 decades, while others held items that could safely be discarded or donated to charitable organizations. The crew developed efficient systems for sorting and categorizing materials, but the sheer volume of accumulated items made progress slower than originally anticipated. The basement storage areas were particularly challenging as they contained not only typical church materials, but also items that had been moved there from other parts of the building over the years. The basement's multiple rooms and interconnected storage areas had become repositories for materials that didn't fit elsewhere, creating a complex archaeological record of the church's activities and changing needs over several decades. As the crew worked through the basement areas, they discovered items that hadn't been seen or used in years, including boxes of materials that apparently dated back to Margaret Phillips' time as organist. These boxes contained sheet music, programs from past services, and organizational materials that reflected Margaret's meticulous approach to church music. Mitchell made note of these materials and set them aside for special handling, recognizing that they might have particular significance for congregation members who remembered Margaret. The attic above the sanctuary was saved for last, partly because accessing it required careful navigation of the narrow staircase, and partly because previous discussions with church leadership had suggested it contained primarily musical materials and old records that might require special handling. Pastor Hendricks, who had retired in 1995 but remained active in the congregation, had warned Mitchell that the attic space was cramped and difficult to work in, with low ceilings and limited lighting that made it challenging even for experienced professionals. When Mitchell and 2 team members, Steve Rodriguez and Danny Chen, finally climbed the steep stairs and opened the door to the attic space on October 15, 2003, they entered an area that felt frozen in time. The cramped world of slanted ceilings, exposed beams, and carefully arranged stacks of boxes and materials was exactly as Pastor Hendricks had described, but it was also somehow more organized and systematic than they had expected based on their experience with other church storage areas. The attic was more organized than they had anticipated, with clear pathways between storage areas and labels on many of the boxes indicating their contents. It was obvious that someone had spent considerable time and effort organizing this space, creating a system that would allow easy access to specific materials when needed. The labels were written in neat, precise handwriting that suggested an individual rather than a committee had been responsible for the organization, and the systematic arrangement of boxes by category and chronology reflected a methodical approach that impressed the professional movers. The team began their work methodically, examining each box and stack to determine what should be preserved, what could be discarded, and what might be valuable enough to require special handling. Many boxes contained sheet music arranged by season and type of service, with Christmas music separated from Easter selections and regular Sunday materials organized according to the church calendar. Other boxes held programs from past services, correspondence related to musical arrangements, and various materials that documented the church's musical activities over several decades. As they worked deeper into the attic space, following the narrow pathways between stacks of materials, Mitchell began to appreciate the sophisticated organization system that someone had created in this challenging environment. Whoever had organized the attic had not simply stored materials randomly, but had created what amounted to a musical library that could serve the church's needs for years to come. The system showed evidence of regular maintenance and updating, suggesting that someone had continued to work in the space over an extended period. Rodriguez, who was working in a section near the center of the attic, called Mitchell's attention to a series of boxes that appeared to contain more recent materials. including sheet music that had been arranged for specific services and dates that could be identified from notations on the covers. These materials seemed to be organized according to a particular event or season, and the careful arrangement suggested they had been assembled for a specific purpose rather than simply stored for future reference. As they continued working in this area, Chen noticed something that seemed out of place in the otherwise systematic organization of the attic space. In a corner area where the slanted ceiling met the floor, partially hidden behind a stack of boxes containing Christmas music, there appeared to be additional items that were not part of the systematic organization evident elsewhere in the space. The items seemed to have been disturbed or displaced from their original arrangement, creating a small area of disorder in an otherwise methodical storage system. Mitchell moved closer with his flashlight to examine the area Chen had identified, and what he saw made him pause and call for additional lighting. There appeared to be scattered papers in the corner area, along with what looked like fabric or clothing that seemed inconsistent with the musical materials that filled the rest of the attic. The items were partially hidden behind boxes and obscured by shadows. But even from a distance, it was clear that something was not right about this particular area. When Mitchell and his team brought additional lighting to the corner and carefully moved the boxes that were obscuring their view, they made a discovery that would finally answer the question that had haunted Cedar Falls for 17 years. But the truth they uncovered was more heartbreaking and profound than anyone could have imagined. In that cramped corner of the church attic, surrounded by the sheet music she had been organizing with such care, lay the remains of Margaret Phillips, along with evidence of her final moments that would reveal a story of dedication, tragedy, and the cruel irony of dying alone while serving the community she loved above all else. The discovery sent immediate shockwaves through everyone present. But Mitchell, drawing on his professional experience and understanding of the gravity of the situation, immediately secured the scene and contacted the Cedar Falls Police Department. Within minutes, the church attic was transformed into a crime scene, though it would soon become clear that no crime had been committed beyond the tragic crime of a dedicated woman dying alone and undiscovered. Detective Sarah Williams, who had inherited many of Manning's old cases when he retired, arrived at the scene within 30 minutes of Mitchell's call, accompanied by crime scene technicians and the county medical examiner. Williams had reviewed Margaret Phillips' case file periodically over the years and was familiar with the details of the investigation, but she had never expected to encounter the solution in such a direct and dramatic fashion. The medical examiner's initial assessment, later confirmed by extensive forensic investigation, revealed that Margaret had died of a stroke, a sudden cerebral event that would have left her confused and disoriented in the cramped attic space. The evidence suggested that she had been organizing Christmas music when the stroke occurred, perhaps attempting to create the perfect musical program for the congregation's most important service of the year, just as Dorothy Hanson had suspected. 17 years earlier, the scene told a story that was both tragic and poignant. Margaret had apparently been working in the corner area of the attic, organizing sheet music for the Christmas Eve service, when she suffered the medical emergency that would claim her life. The stroke would have caused immediate disorientation and physical incapacitation, leaving her unable to call for help or make her way back down the narrow staircase to safety. In her final moments, as her body failed and her mind struggled against the effects of the cerebral event, Margaret Phillips had died doing what she had always done, serving her church community with quiet dedication and unwavering commitment. The sheet music she had been organizing was still arranged around her, a testament to her final act of service and a heartbreaking reminder of the Christmas program that would never be performed as she had envisioned it. The discovery explained the mystery that had puzzled investigators for nearly 2 decades. Margaret had not been abducted, had not left voluntarily, and had not met with foul play. She had simply been in the wrong place when a medical emergency struck, trapped in a space where she could not call for help and where no one would think to look for her body. The church building that had been her sanctuary had become her tomb, and the music she loved had been her silent witness during her final moments. The irony was profound and heartbreaking. The extensive search that had been conducted immediately after Margaret's disappearance had covered every accessible area of the church building. But the cramped attic space above the sanctuary had been overlooked because it was considered too difficult to access, and because no one imagined that Margaret would have been working there during a regular evening practice session. The searchers had been looking for signs of struggle, evidence of foul play, or indications that Margaret had left the building, not for a medical emergency that had occurred in an area where she had every right to be. The community's response to the discovery was a complex mixture of grief, relief, and profound sadness. The mystery had finally been solved, but the solution brought no comfort, only the heartbreaking realization that Margaret Phillips had died alone, surrounded by the sheet music she had been organizing for a Christmas service she would never conduct. The tragic irony was not lost on anyone in the congregation. This woman, who had dedicated her life to bringing music and joy to others, had spent her final moments in solitude, with only the silent notes on paper to keep her company. Pastor Hendricks, now retired but still deeply connected to the St. Andrew's community, was among the first to visit the church after the discovery was announced. Standing in the sanctuary where Margaret had played for 30 years, looking up toward the attic where she had died, he was overwhelmed by the realization that the woman who had provided so much spiritual comfort to others had faced her final moments without the comfort of human companionship. The current pastor, Reverend Linda Morrison, who had arrived at St. Andrews in 1998 and had known Margaret only through the stories told by longtime congregation members, found herself struggling to help the community process this unexpected resolution to a mystery that had become part of the church's identity. The discovery raised difficult questions about how well the congregation had really known Margaret, whether anyone had been aware of the extent of her work in the dangerous attic space, and whether her death could have been prevented through better safety measures or more attentive care for elderly volunteers. Margaret's children, now middle-aged adults with their own families and careers, were contacted immediately after the discovery and traveled to Cedar Falls to deal with the practical and emotional consequences of finally learning their mother's fate. David Phillips, who had spent months in 1987 searching for answers and had never completely given up hope that his mother might someday return, experienced a complex mixture of relief and renewed grief as he finally learned the truth about her disappearance. The funeral that Margaret Phillips had been denied in 1987 finally took place in November 2003, 17 years after her death, and in the same sanctuary where she had served faithfully for 3 decades. The service was attended by hundreds of people, including congregation members who had known and loved Margaret, community members who remembered her contributions to Cedar Falls' cultural life, and people who had only learned of her story through news coverage of the discovery, but were moved by the tragedy of her unrecognized death. Pastor Morrison spoke at the service about the profound lesson Margaret's death provided about the hidden sacrifices made by countless volunteers in communities. Everywhere, people who work quietly behind the scenes to create beauty, meaning, and spiritual connection for others. Margaret Phillips had died as she had lived in service to others, working to create something beautiful for people who might never fully appreciate the effort and dedication involved. The service featured many of the Christmas arrangements that Margaret had been organizing on her final evening, pieces that had been preserved in the attic and were finally performed 17 years after she had assembled them with such care. As the congregation sang the familiar hymns accompanied by the pipe organ she had played for 30 years, many felt that Margaret's spirit had finally found peace, and her music had finally found its intended voice. Eleanor Patterson, who had served as organist at St. Andrews for more than 15 years following Margaret's disappearance, provided the musical accompaniment for the memorial service, but she had requested that several of Margaret's former piano students also participate in the program. The result was a musical celebration that spanned generations and reflected Margaret's lasting influence on the musical life of Cedar Falls. The church community established a memorial fund in Margaret's name, dedicated to supporting music education and church safety programs that would ensure that future generations would understand both the importance of the arts in spiritual life and the need to protect elderly volunteers who serve in potentially dangerous situations. The fund supported scholarships for young musicians, safety improvements in church buildings throughout the region, and programs designed to ensure that elderly volunteers never work alone in situations where medical emergencies could prove fatal. The cramped attic where Margaret had died was completely renovated and converted into a properly accessible archive space, with safety features including improved lighting, better ventilation, communication systems that would allow anyone working in the space to call for help, and structural modifications that eliminated the dangerous conditions that had contributed to Margaret's death. The renovated space was named the Margaret Phillips Memorial Archive, and it served as both a practical facility for storing the church's historical materials and a reminder of the importance of maintaining safe working conditions for volunteers. Margaret Phillips was finally laid to rest in Cedar Falls Memorial Cemetery in a plot next to her husband Robert, where she was surrounded by family members and community leaders who had been part of her life for more than 7 decades. The gravestone, purchased by the church congregation, included not only her name and dates, but also a musical staff with the opening notes of "Amazing Grace," the hymn that had been her favorite and that she had played countless times during her years of service. The story of Margaret Phillips serves as a powerful reminder of the hidden heroes who make community life possible. The quiet volunteers who work behind the scenes to create beauty, meaning, and connection for others. Her tragic death illuminates the vulnerability of elderly people who give their time and energy to institutions they love, often working alone in large buildings where medical emergencies can become fatal due to isolation and lack of immediate assistance. But perhaps most importantly, Margaret's story celebrates the power of dedication and service, the way one person's commitment to excellence and beauty can touch countless lives and create lasting meaning. Even in death, she continued to serve her community by teaching them about the importance of cherishing the people who make ordinary moments extraordinary, and about ensuring that no one should have to face their final moments alone and unrecognized. The mystery of Margaret Phillips's disappearance had finally been solved after 17 years, but the greater mystery of how one person's quiet service can create such profound meaning remained as powerful and inspiring as ever. Her music, her dedication, and her memory would live on forever in the hearts of the community she had served so faithfully, and her story would continue to inspire others to recognize and appreciate the Margaret Phillips in their own communities. The quiet heroes whose service makes everything else possible. In the years following the discovery, St. Andrew's Methodist Church instituted new policies requiring that no one work alone in the building during evening hours, that all volunteers inform others of their planned activities and expected departure times, and that regular safety checks be conducted in all areas of the building where people might be working. These policies, known informally as Margaret's Rules, were adopted by churches throughout Iowa and became a model for religious institutions seeking to protect their volunteers while honoring their dedication. Margaret Phillips, had vanished. On a December evening in 1986, but her legacy of service, her commitment to excellence, and her quiet heroism had finally been recognized and would never be forgotten again. The music she had prepared for that Christmas Eve service was performed every year thereafter, becoming a tradition that connected each new generation of congregants to the woman who had given her life in service to their spiritual needs. In death, as in life, Margaret Phillips continued to bring beauty, meaning, and inspiration to the community she had served with such unwavering dedication.